Silence. Not the silence that precedes a storm, but the one that follows. The silence of scorched earth. A silence in which the last echoes of a crumbling reality still hang in the air. It is from such silences that the most resilient nightmares are born. Nightmares that do not scream, but whisper. And that whisper can be heard for decades. This story does not begin with an explosion, but with a slow, methodical retreat from the world. It does not take place in hell, but in a place its inhabitants called the Promised Land. This is the story of how faith, that very force meant to elevate souls to the light, was used to build a perfect prison. A prison for minds, for bodies, for generations. This is the story of the family. And to understand how such a thing became possible, we must journey back. Back to an era when the entire world was trying to heal its wounds. The mid-1940s. New Zealand, a nation distant from the epicenters of global conflict, yet deeply marked by its aftermath. It was a time of order, of rebuilding, of seeking solid ground after the chaos. And in this atmosphere, a man named Winston Herbert Ridley was conducting his own spiritual revolution. He was a veteran, a man who had seen the face of modern warfare. He carried with him the discipline of a soldier and the searching mind of someone who had witnessed the abyss. By all accounts, he was intelligent, fiercely so. He possessed a natural charisma, a commanding presence that drew people in. He was a man of conviction, and in a world unmoored, conviction is a powerful anchor. He was also a devout Seventh-day Adventist, a faith with a profound emphasis on prophecy, on the imminence of the end times, and on living a life of strict adherence to God's law as a preparation for the final judgment. But Winston Ridley's interpretations of Scripture began to diverge, slowly at first, then with increasing radicalism, from the mainstream church. He started receiving what he described as direct revelations. Visions. Instructions. He became convinced that the established churches were not just flawed, they were apostate. They were part of Babylon the Great, the whore of Revelation, corrupted by their compromise with the world. He preached that the true faithful, the remnant, had to separate themselves completely. Not just spiritually, but physically. They had to become a people set apart, a community so pure, so insulated from the world's corruption, that they would be worthy to stand as God's final representatives on earth. He found a receptive audience. People disillusioned with the post-war world, seeking deeper meaning, clearer answers. Among them was a woman named Joan. She saw in Ridley not just a preacher, but a prophet. She became his first disciple, his most ardent supporter, and then, his wife. Together, they began to attract a small circle of followers. They were drawn by Ridley's magnetic certainty, his powerful oratory that could make the complex prophecies of Daniel and Revelation seem like a clear blueprint for the future. They began to meet regularly, studying the Bible through the lens of Ridley's expanding revelations. They called their group, with deliberate symbolism, the branch. They saw themselves as the true branch of the vine of Christ, severed from the rotten tree of mainstream Christianity, destined to bear the true fruit. In these early days, the atmosphere was likely one of excitement, of purpose. They were pioneers of a new spiritual frontier. Photographs from this time show them on picnics, engaged in Bible study, their faces reflecting a sense of shared mission. But beneath the surface of this idyllic community, the first, subtle distortions were beginning to take shape. The teachings began to crystallize around two central, interconnected pillars: absolute obedience and the sanctity of the bloodline. Ridley's theology positioned him as God's sole, unchallenged channel on earth. He was the mouthpiece of the divine. His interpretations were not open for debate, they were divine decree. To question Winston Ridley was not to disagree with a man, it was to disagree with God. Disobedience, therefore, was not mere error, it was the ultimate sin, or rebellion against the Holy Spirit itself. This created a spiritual environment where independent thought was not just discouraged, it was pathologized as a symptom of sinfulness. Then, in the late 1960s, came the pivotal revelation, the one that would fundamentally transform the branch into the family. God, Ridley claimed, had given him a new and urgent directive. The group could no longer remain a loose collection of believers. To survive the coming tribulation and remain pure, they had to become a true family. A closed system. A biological and spiritual fortress. The few adult men in the group, apart from Ridley himself, were deemed a potential source of discord, of competing authority. They were to be sent away. And in a move that echoed the polygamy of Old Testament patriarchs, Winston Ridley, as the spiritual father, would take the women of the group as his wives. This, he taught, was a modern-day enactment of Davidic kingship, a necessary step to build a righteous dynasty. This was the first major schism. Some members, confronted with this radical departure from normative Christian practice, left. They could not reconcile this new doctrine with their faith. But those who remained underwent a profound psychological shift. Their commitment was tested, and they passed the test by surrendering their previous understandings. They sold their possessions, severed all ties with their biological families, a necessary sacrifice, they were told, to gain their true, spiritual family, and followed Ridley into the wilderness. They purchased a remote, rugged, and breathtakingly beautiful piece of land on the west coast of New Zealand's South Island. This was a place of primal power, dense, dripping rainforests, steep, forbidding gorges carved by raging rivers, and a sky that could deliver relentless rainfall. It was a land that demanded self-reliance and promised isolation. They named it the Promised Land. And it was here, shielded by geography and their own growing insularity, that the branch ceased to exist, and the entity known as the family was born. Isolated from all external influence, Winston Ridley's vision could now be implemented without compromise. The outside world was systematically demonized. It was referred to as the system, a satanic, globalist construct destined for imminent and violent destruction. Contact with the system was forbidden, as it was a corrupting poison. The family's children were born into this reality. They were homeschooled with a curriculum designed entirely by Ridley, a peculiar fusion of advanced mathematics, practical engineering, and his own unique, terrifying eschatology. They were taught, from their first moments of comprehension, that they were special. They were the only righteous people left on earth. The final inheritors of God's kingdom. Everyone outside was an enemy, an agent of Satan, either knowingly or unknowingly. The social structure of the family was now set in its definitive form, a single patriarch, his multiple wives, and their collectively raised children. It was a closed circuit of belief and blood, designed to be self-perpetuating. But a system, like a living organism, must grow. And as it grew, it began to mutate in ways that perhaps even its creator did not fully anticipate. The ideology of control would soon be forged into a weapon of psychological annihilation. Life inside the family was a study in totalitarian precision. It was an existence devoid of randomness, of personal choice. Every minute of every day was regimented, orchestrated by the sound of a bell. The bell dictated waking, working, praying, eating, and sleeping. Idleness was not merely laziness, it was a sin, a vacuum into which sinful thoughts could creep. Private thought itself was suspect, as it represented a space outside of Dad's control. The children were raised communally in a creche, cared for by all the women. This was a deliberate policy to break the possessive, individual bonds of motherly love. A child's primary attachment was not to be to their biological mother, but to the family as a whole. And since Winston Ridley was the head of the family, the fountainhead of all authority and divine truth, the ultimate bond was to him. He was "Dad" to all, a title that blurred the lines between paternal affection, spiritual authority, and absolute dictatorship. Ridley's control was a three-stranded rope: psychological, spiritual, and physical. He implemented a system of correction that was both brutally straightforward and insidiously sophisticated. Transgressions, a missed prayer, a muttered complaint, a moment of hesitation, a glance of curiosity towards the outside world, were met with severe, immediate corporal punishment. But the true genius, and the true horror, of his control lay in the theological framework that surrounded this violence. The punishment was never presented as an outburst of anger. It was framed as an act of love. God's purifying love, channeled through Dad, burning away the sin to save the soul. The child was taught that the pain they felt was the manifestation of God's love rescuing them from their own inherent evil. To be hit was to be saved. According to the harrowing testimonies of those who later escaped, the children were systematically taught that their own wills were evil. A child's natural desire for autonomy, for play, for personal preference, was reframed as a manifestation of the serpent seed within them. To want something that Dad had not provided or sanctioned was a sin. To feel anger at a punishment or resentment towards a sibling, or even simple boredom during a long prayer session, was not a normal human emotion, it was a sign of deep-seated corruption. The goal was the complete and utter erasure of the individual will. The ideal state was one of perfect, vacant submission. To become an empty vessel, ready to be filled only with God's Spirit, a Spirit that spoke with one voice, and one voice only, the voice of Winston Ridley. The outside world was maintained as a constant, grotesque caricature. Systemites were depicted as morally bankrupt, degenerate, and doomed. They were cartoons of sin. Any accidental contact was treated as a grave spiritual danger. If a car from the outside world was spotted on the distant public road that bordered their property, the children would be hurried inside. They were told the occupants were government agents, Satan's spies, who would kidnap, torture, and likely kill them if they were ever caught. This created a powerful, phobic aversion to the world beyond the fence, turning the wilderness not into a prison they wanted to escape, but a fortress they were terrified to leave. As the children grew into adolescence, Ridley's doctrines expanded to encompass sexuality, the most powerful and vulnerable aspect of human experience. He taught that all sexual activity outside of his direct sanction was impure, a tool of the system. Marriages were arranged by him alone, and they often involved unions between close relatives, first cousins, uncles, and nieces, a practice justified by the need to keep the bloodline pure and within the sanctity of the family. He controlled who could marry, when, and for what procreative purpose. He positioned himself as the ultimate authority on the most intimate aspects of life, the gatekeeper of desire and relationship. There were persistent allegations, later vehemently denied by some within the family but supported by multiple escapee accounts, of more sinister and predatory abuses, of Ridley using his absolute power to exploit the young women and girls who saw him as God's sole representative on earth. Paradoxically, the family was not a destitute cult. Winston Ridley, a brilliant and ruthless organizer, channeled the discipline of his followers into successful business ventures. They established a sawmill, a construction company, a farm. They worked with a ferocious, religious intensity, and the money flowed back into the commune. They were not just surviving, they were prospering. This wealth was used to build elaborate, fortress-like homes, interconnected tunnels, and extensive underground storage facilities. They were becoming entirely self-sufficient, financially secure, and physically impenetrable. They were not just waiting for the end of the world, they were building an ark to survive it. An ark not of wood, but of faith, fear, reinforced concrete, and cold, hard cash. By the 1980s, the family was a mature and formidable organism. A society of over 50 people, living in a state of perpetual spiritual siege, a world unto itself. Winston Ridley was aging, but his control, reinforced by decades of indoctrination and a loyal inner circle, was absolute. The children of the first generation were now adults, many with children of their own. They had known no other life. Their reality, however constructed, was the only reality they possessed. The walls around the promised land were no longer just physical barriers of wood and wire, they were etched into the very neural pathways of their minds, the foundations of their consciousness. But even the most perfectly engineered system can develop flaws. And the flaw, as it so often does, came from within. The first cracks began as hairline fractures, almost invisible, but they would soon widen into chasms. The first external threat to the family's isolation came from the most predictable of places, the outside world itself. Neighbors, delivery drivers, and contractors who had occasional, limited dealings with the group began to compare notes. The stories were strange, unsettling. The identical, drab clothing. The unnerving lack of eye contact. The way the children, when seen, seemed pale, subdued, and would vanish on cue when outsiders approached. Whispers began to circulate through the small communities of the West Coast. Whispers of strange punishments, of children who seemed afraid of their own shadows. These whispers eventually reached the authorities. Police and child welfare services began to make visits. But they were met with a wall of polite, unified, and impenetrable resistance. The children, meticulously coached and gripped by a genuine, phobic terror of the system, would deny any mistreatment, often reciting scripted answers. The adults would present a united front, reciting prepared statements about their religious freedoms and their right to live according to their beliefs. The homes were spotless, the children appeared well-fed and healthy by basic physical standards. Without concrete evidence of abuse, without a single cooperative witness from inside, the authorities' hands were tied. The family had become a black box. You could knock on the walls, you could peer through the cracks, but you could not see inside. They were protected by their own perfection as much as by their secrecy. But the greater, more existential threat was internal. As the second generation came of age, seeds of doubt, planted by rare, illicit glimpses of the outside world, began to sprout. Some of the young men, who had been raised on a doctrine that told them they were the spiritual princes of a new world, began to chafe under Ridley's micromanagement. They had been taught they were destined for leadership, but they were granted no autonomy. There were hushed arguments, power struggles, subtle challenges to Ridley's authority from within his own inner circle. Ridley, a master of control, sensed this descent instantly. His response was swift and ruthless. Purges began to occur. Families, men, along with their wives and children, who were deemed to have shown insufficient loyalty, or who posed a potential challenge, were cast out from the Promised Land. They were shunned, excommunicated, and forced into the very world they had been taught to fear and despise. These exiles were the first major cracks in the dam. They were thrown into a world for which they were completely unprepared, traumatized, destitute, and psychologically disoriented. But they were free. And they carried with them something more valuable than any possession: stories. Detailed, consistent, and horrifying accounts of life under Winston Ridley's rule. One of the most significant events was the departure of a young man we will refer to as David. David was one of Ridley's favored sons, intelligent, capable, and deeply indoctrinated. But a mind trained to seek patterns and truth, even within a twisted framework, can sometimes turn that faculty back on the framework itself. David began to secretly question the doctrine. He managed to obtain contraband books, magazines, and perhaps even a radio. He saw that the outside world was not the cartoonish, demonic hellscape he had been taught. It was complex, flawed, but also filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives. The cognitive dissonance between the reality he was shown and the reality he observed became unbearable. In the dead of night, with a courage that is difficult to fathom, he fled. He left behind everyone and everything he had ever known, his parents, his siblings, his entire universe. David's escape was a seismic event within the family. He was not a cast-out dissident, he was a voluntary apostate. His departure was a living, breathing repudiation of their entire belief system. He was declared a traitor, his name cursed, his memory erased from the group's narrative. But for others, particularly the young, his escape also provided a terrifying, thrilling beacon of possibility. If David could survive out there in the system, if the world did not instantly swallow him whole, then perhaps the teachings were not entirely true. Perhaps there was another way. A slow, quiet exodus began. Mostly young adults, stealing away in the night, their hearts pounding with a mixture of sheer terror and a fragile, desperate hope. These escapees became the primary sources for the outside world. They carried with them a fragmented, but devastatingly clear, picture of life inside the family. Journalists began to piece the story together. Articles were written. Television documentaries were aired, their cameras capturing the stark, fortress-like buildings from a distance. The secret was out. The world was no longer just knocking politely on the door, it was circling the property with spotlights. Winston Herbert Ridley died in 2007. According to official records, his death was from natural causes. But for the members of the family, it was an event of apocalyptic significance. Their prophet, their father, their God on earth, was gone. What happens to a universe when its center, its gravitational core, suddenly vanishes? The answer was both nothing and everything. The physical structure of the family remained. The businesses, the properties, the people, they were all still there. But the charismatic, terrifying force that had animated the entire project, the singular will that had bent reality to its design, was absent. In the absence of the prophet, a new leadership structure emerged, composed of his eldest sons and most loyal wives. They maintained the routines, the doctrines, the isolation. They kept the machinery running. But the soul of the machine was gone. It had become a ritual without its high priest, a faith without its living deity. In the years since Ridley's death, the outside world has continued to press in. Law enforcement, now armed with the powerful, cumulative testimonies of escapees, launched more thorough and aggressive investigations. In 2021, the world watched as New Zealand police executed a massive, coordinated raid on the family's properties. It was a dramatic, televised event. Officers in tactical gear, search warrants in hand, scoured the houses and the land, looking for evidence, for documentation, for the final, conclusive proof of the decades of alleged abuse. But what was found? And what was not found? The investigations resulted in criminal charges against several members for historical abuse. Some were convicted and sentenced to prison. It was a measure of justice, however delayed. For the victims, it was a validation of their suffering. But for many observers, it felt incomplete. The full story, the deepest, darkest secrets of what transpired in those homes and in the depths of those forests over 5 decades, remained largely locked away. The members who stayed were as closed-mouthed and insular as ever. The walls, it seemed, had held, even after the architect was gone. And so, we are left with the haunting, unanswerable questions that define this story. The questions that linger in the silence. Was Winston Ridley a calculating madman, a brilliant and sadistic manipulator who constructed an elaborate prison for his own gratification and power? Or was he a true believer, a man so utterly convinced of his own divine mission that any atrocity could be justified in its name? A man who started by deceiving others and ended by deceiving himself on a grand, catastrophic scale? What is the ultimate, human toll? The children who escaped, now adults, carry deep, complex psychological scars. They struggle with trust, with identity, with the simple, daily act of living in a world they were conditioned to fear. They are free in body, but many remain haunted, their inner lives still shadowed by the doctrines of their youth. They are engaged in a lifelong project of building a self from the broken pieces that were left to them. And what of those who remain? They are still there, on the West Coast, living their lives according to the blueprint of a dead prophet. Are they victims, prisoners of an ideology built in their childhood? Or are they now perpetuators, maintaining the system that abused them and preparing to pass it on to the next generation? The line is terrifyingly, tragically blurred. Some believe the whole truth died with Winston Ridley. That the full extent of his control, the darkest rituals, the fates of any who may have died under mysterious circumstances and been buried in unmarked graves on that vast property, were secrets he took to his grave. The official records tell one story, a story of abuse and conviction. But the profound silence that surrounds those records, the refusal of the core group to speak, whispers of a deeper, darker history. A history that may be buried forever in the dense, wet soil of the promised land. The story of the family is not a ghost story in the conventional sense. There are no rattling chains, no spectral apparitions. The ghosts here are the living. They are the echoes of stolen childhoods, the shadows of what might have been. It is a chilling case study in how the most noble of human impulses, the search for faith, meaning, and community, can be perverted into the most absolute tyranny. It is a lesson in how love, that most essential bond, can be weaponized into a tool of control. And it is a terrifying demonstration of how the concept of family, the one institution we are taught to trust above all others, can be meticulously engineered into a perfect, inescapable trap. Winston Ridley sought to create a new world from the ungrunned, from the formless, primordial void he believed was the origin of divinity. He sought to be the God of his own creation. And in a very real, very horrifying sense, he succeeded. He created a universe with its own laws, its own morality, its own distorted reality. A universe contained within a few hundred acres of remote New Zealand wilderness. But the void he embraced, the nothingness he believed was divine, did not save his followers. It consumed them. It consumed their pasts, their identities, their potential futures. And the most haunting question of all, the one that lingers long after the details fade, is this: when you are raised in a void, taught to worship the emptiness, can you ever truly be filled with anything else? Or do you spend the rest of your life as an echo, a reverberation of the silence that made you?